All right, I think we can go ahead and get started, and people can join as they join. Yeah, should I go ahead and get started? Do we think we're ready? All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for being here. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that Princeton University sits on land that was taken forcibly from the Lenni Lenape tribe. If not for the pandemic, this event would be taking place on Princeton's campus. And we also want to start by acknowledging that the pandemic and the climate crises are intertwined, and both exacerbate systems of oppression, which impact Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Divest Princeton really wants to be part of the movement towards a more just world. That's why we're here, and thank you all for joining us. We're really glad you're here with us tonight. Yeah, I'm gonna move on and go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Marta Cabral. I was class of 2016, and I've been involved with Divest Princeton for a couple of months now. And as we get started, yeah, as I said before, but for anyone who just joined, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. And I'm gonna go over what we'll be talking about today, give you all an idea of what tonight looks like, and then turn it over to our coordinators to kick us off. Yeah, so this evening our plan is really just to go give a little introduction of Divest Princeton, start from the beginning, talk about who we are, how we came to be, a little bit about what our divestment proposal is about. We're also going to talk about where we are in the process as far as talking with Princeton University about divestment. We're also going to answer some common questions, and then we'll have time to answer any questions of yours. So please, as questions come up, please feel free to post them in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye out on that, and we really want to hear, we want this event to be useful for you. So any questions you have, no stupid questions, please put them in the chat. And before I turn it over to our coordinators, I also want to talk a little bit about some events we have coming up in February. So one event that's happening at Princeton, that's an exciting talk. It looks like we have some new arrivals. If everyone perfect, but we like having representation from all age groups on our calls, so that's great. Okay, so where was I? February, so we are having a February month of action. So one event that's going on at Princeton that we're looking forward to is that Anand Giridharadas, the author of Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World, will be speaking at Princeton on February 10th. And we're hoping to ask some questions about divestment. It should be an exciting talk, so stay tuned for that event. Divest Princeton, we are also hosting a talk with Varshini Prakash, who's one of the founders of the Sunrise Movement, on February 16th. So that will be really exciting as well. Stay tuned for more information about that. And then our another event that Divest Princeton has going on in February is that the week of February 22nd, we'll be having a talk about the financial case for divestment with some alumni who work in the field. So anyone who's especially interested in the financial side, that might be a good talk to look out for. And I think with that, I will turn it over to our wonderful coordinators this year, Ryan Warsing and Anna Hiltner. Take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta. So we just have a brief little description about sort of what Divest Princeton is and how we go about doing everything that we do. Probably the best thing to do is I'll start off with just a little historical synopsis. Divest Princeton is not the first group started to divest Princeton's endowment from fossil fuels. We are, depending on how you define it, maybe the third or fourth. The last substantial effort really took place about half a decade ago, and since then, a lot of things have happened. That effort failed for a variety of reasons, but in the time since, the Princeton faculty have gotten together and put together a sustainability action plan at President Eisgruber's direction that calls for national decarbonization and a whole bunch of other things that we think are really substantial and are kind of the groundwork for why this effort is picking up more steam than previous efforts have. Also in the interim, In 2018 was a special report from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, that basically says we've got no time at all to start making serious reductions in our emissions in order to avert climate disaster by mid-century. So with that all in mind, a few of our members, Aita Maiza and Anna Leibowitz, they wrote a letter in, I believe, October of 2019 that said basically that they would be not donating to the university until divestment was achieved. Many of you might have since signed on to that letter. I hope all of you have signed on to that letter. I have, all of our on-campus members have. That became sort of our first rallying point, where we started to organize. Those of us that were on campus started meeting weekly, Mondays at 6. You're all welcome to join. We still keep up that time spot. And we've really grown. We've got over 2,000 signatures on that petition. We've since had referendums with the university and so on. So we've really grown from an organization of 2 people to over 2,000 people. And of that, we're really, really proud. So I'll turn it over to Anna to talk a little more.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for coming. It's so good to see so many people. I'm Anna, I'm the other co-coordinator, and I'm a sophomore undergraduate. So as Ryan was saying, Divest Princeton is a coalition of students, alumni, faculty, and staff calling on Princeton University to terminate formal associations with and divest its endowment from the fossil fuel industry. More specifically, this includes any fossil fuel companies that, 1, develop or make plans to develop fossil fuel resources whose emissions would exceed the UN's climate change goals, and/or 2, spread or facilitate the spread of climate disinformation. We also, in general, I think, ask for more transparency from the administration. I think the Princeton community deserves to have a role in making sure that our endowment and other practices are ethical and sustainable. So more about Divest Princeton. As Ryan just told you, it was founded in the fall of 2019. And we now have 2,135 signatures on our no donations until divestment open letter to Eisgruber and the administration. Our open letter is essentially a call to action. It's not simply a petition, but a call to action which asks our supporters in the Princeton community to commit to not donating to Princeton until it divests. So our open letter is the largest asking to withhold donations and 4th, soon to be 3rd, largest petition in Princeton's history to our knowledge. We also have almost 700 public endorsements that you can read on our website from Princeton students, alumni, faculty, staff, campus groups, and other prominent supporters such as Bill McKibben and Jane Goodall, among others. An undergraduate referendum on fossil fuel divestment and dissociation recently passed, with 82% voting yes. And in the same election, we had 17 of the 19 USG candidates publicly support Divest Princeton's proposal. So this past year, we have seen an incredible amount of momentum, and I'm ready to see a lot more as we start the semester, especially because we expect the board to consider our proposal this semester. And yeah, next, I think it would be good to speak a bit about the precedent and history of divestment at Princeton University. So during the 1970s and 80s, I'm sure some of you remember this, student groups like Princeton's Front for the Liberation of South Africa called on Princeton to divest from companies operating in South Africa during the apartheid. And in their decision, the university stated that divestiture should occur when such action seems required to prevent the university from being associated with a company whose behavior has been found to represent a clear and serious conflict with the central values of the university, which we argue applies to fossil fuel divestment as well. And then the second instance of divestment at Princeton University was in 2006, the Board of Trustees voted to dissociate from companies that conducted operations in Darfur that supported acts of genocide. And they voted to prevent future investment in these companies. So looking at the history of divestment at Princeton, and we actually have a timeline of divestment movements on our website. If you want to take a look, I can quickly put it in the chat. But we know now that there's definitely the consensus and the precedent for divestment from fossil fuels on campus. If you look at institutions, including, among others, Cornell, Brown, Oxford, Cambridge, the University of California, funds such as the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, who we had a talk with, the Vatican and others have committed to divesting from fossil fuels in the near future, which I think shows the university and the administration that there is an increasing collective urgency among institutional investors and among student movements like our own. So now I'll turn to Ryan and Graham again to speak on how far we have come since Divest Princeton was founded in fall 2019.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. Turning it over to Graham and Ryan, who will give us a little update on where we are in the current process.
Awesome, so good to see everybody. My name is Graham Turk. I am from the great class of 2017. One of the awesome parts of being part of this movement as an alum is that the university can't do anything to you because you've already graduated, and they can't take your degree away as far as we know at this point. So I want to walk through a little bit about the process for divestment, what it looks like at Princeton, and then as Marta mentioned, where we are now and kind of a tee-in for what we can do to work on it. So I'm going to quickly share a couple of slides. Let's see if I can do this successfully. Oh, it looks like Marta, can you enable my screen share? And if not, I can send you the link so you can share them for me.
I can certainly try. Tom,
here, I'm gonna send you the link so that you can present, and I can walk you through it.
Okay. Let me go ahead and do that right now. One moment, everyone. Thank you for your patience. Oh. Okay.
I'm just going to take it. Whoops. Oh, no, it's working. Great.
Fantastic. You could do full screen.
Yes. Let me just move some
If
things around so I can reach it. How?
Okay, everybody.
Great.
Perfect. So you all are looking at the only guiding document that the Resources Committee is given to consider divestment. So at Princeton, the process for divestment is that you submit a petition to an institution called the Resources Committee. They're a branch of the Council of the Princeton University Community. They then consider the divestment proposal on the basis of these 5 questions. There is very little else provided. It's a guideline that the Board of Trustees gives them and uses a bit of precedent from past divestment campaigns, but by and large, it is a very minimalist document. And so you have to answer these 5 questions, and as part of the divestment, any divestment campaign, convince the Resources Committee that your campaign meets these criteria. So if you go to the next slide. So I have thought that this has been a little bit like a game of Candyland. I don't know if anyone's played this game. I haven't in many years, but it feels like to advance to each square, sometimes you got to go back, sometimes you got to work forward. And we are kind of standing on the shoulders of past divestment movements that have moved the envelope, pushed the envelope a little bit to get us to where we are today. So if you go to the next slide, here are those criteria written out again. And we'll tick through each of them one by one. So the first thing you need to pass any divestment campaign is considerable and continuing campus interest. So considerable and continuing, what does that mean? It's not very clear, but in previous divestment initiatives, they have used interest over multiple years, multiple divestment proposals submitted for the same issue. That we know for sure we have with this issue. There was a 2015 divestment proposal submitted. The issue of climate action has been broad on campus. and from the alumni base for a long time. And so I think that gets a resounding yes. Although it is hard to establish when many of the students involved in these campaigns are only there for 4 years and then move on. So we've advanced to the next square, we've made it. The next question is there a central university value at stake? Well, that's kind of tough to define because if you go to Firestone Library and you search in the deepest trove of the deepest archive, you will find nowhere that the university has actually written down what their central values are. In the service of all humanity is kind of the closest we'll get, but it's not written down. And for that reason, it's hard to prove that a value is central without really any explicit direction from the university. But in this case, for this divestment movement, we believe that we have a very clear statement by virtue of the university's Sustainability Action Plan, which was published in 2019, that action on climate change is a central value, as borne out by the university's teaching, research, and their goal to get to net zero emissions by 2046, which is a symbolic goal. 2046 is, of course, the 300-year anniversary of the university, but it is also within the timeline that the Paris Agreement and all international science organizations have set for us to achieve net zero emissions, which is earlier than 2050. Of course, we'd love action faster than that, but by virtue of setting that target, Princeton is making a clear statement that science-based emissions reduction is a central value. So we made it to the next square, consensus now, consensus on how to respond in a fair and consistent manner. Well, this is tough again, because what does consensus mean? Is it 51%? Is it 75%? Is it 100? What about professors who might take money from fossil fuel companies and have a clear interest in continuing to partner with them? On this, we do believe we've put out a very fair proposal that we are working with the Resources Committee on to advance to the board that does have their support and broad campus support from the many endorsements we have. And lastly, the last square before we get to divest, not exactly, we get to develop recommendations to the board, but the last square is that there is a particular action that the company is undertaking that conflicts with a central university value. And in this case, the two we have identified are one, the spread of misinformation related to climate change, and two, developing targets, making plans to develop investing in fossil fuel resources that exceed those Paris agreements. And there's plenty of examples of companies who do both. What's tricky about this requirement is that the action of the company has to be so egregious that it warrants complete dissociation. So it's not enough to say, well, this company is not great, so we're going to pull our endowment money. You also have to be willing to completely cut ties, which means you can't accept money from them. You can't have research partnerships with them. They can't do on-campus recruiting. And in this case, we are well within the belief that these companies have violated that value, and that not only would we be pulling our endowment dollars, but we would also end formal research partnerships with these companies, who in many cases use those partnerships to shield from a lot worse activity like lobbying against climate action at the federal and state levels. So that is a lightning fast review of how the divestment process works. And I just wanted to show you on the next slide an example of how we've used this to craft our own divestment proposal. So the first criteria is the underlying issue of significant importance and a considerable and continuing campus interest. Well, as you can see, we have an amazing amount of support. We've gotten, this number is out of date, actually over 2,000 petition signatures. The referendum was an overwhelming success with 82% saying yes, Princeton should absolutely divest. We've gotten over 400 endorsements in addition to the 2015 divestment proposal, and no public opposition to divestment except for one very special alum who thinks climate change is a hoax and happens to take hundreds of thousands of dollars from oil and gas companies. So no surprise there, and it was a nice thing of him to give us the free PR. Next slide, please, Marta. So this is sometimes what it feels like, putting together these proposals. As you can see on the slide after this is the whole map. If anyone is willing to dig into it, I'm happy to walk through why we believe we have all of the pieces in place to move forward with our proposal. And then just to tick through a couple more things specific to our campaign, if you go to the next slide. This is the open letter I was talking about. So wow, only over 2,100 now signatures pledging not to donate to Princeton University until divestment occurs. And I think we get a lot of questions about this. And I'll talk when we do the breakout rooms on how I discussed this with my alumni class council and with our class giving captains. This is not saying that we don't think Princeton's mission is worthy, and we don't think that they are using the donations well, or even that the donation money goes to the endowment. None of that is true. However, this is the biggest piece of leverage we have as students and alumni to show the university what matters to us. Not donating is a statement that says it is so important that the university cut ties with these companies that we are willing to forego doing something we really care about, which is giving back to the university. And as soon as they divest, we would be happy to donate once again. If you could go to the next slide. This is just one example. So we've been sending letters. I don't know if anyone's been solicited for money in the last couple of months, but these cards that go out where people can make a divestment pledge, we've been sending them back. And this is probably my favorite one ever. I'll just give you a moment to read it. And lots of other stories that are all on the website where folks are demonstrating to the university why they're not giving. It's not an issue of wanting to take money away from financial aid programs or anything like that. It's that we can't donate in good conscience because the university continues to enable companies that are perpetuating climate change. Next slide. I've only got a couple more, I promise, and then I'll shut up and stop talking. So we've gotten a lot of endorsements, as I said, hundreds of endorsements, faculty, alumni, staff, students, and also some very prominent people in the environmental field. You can go through those endorsement page and actually read each endorsement. Once we jump up this, it's really cool to see why everybody has signed on, what personal connection they have to the campaign. And last, I think, a couple of high-profile divestments from around the world. So Princeton would not be the first. Unfortunately, we can't claim to really be at the front of the pack. We're kind of just catching up. There's been tons of universities that have done it. The RBF is the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is a beautiful irony, and that fund was mostly funded out of oil riches and has chosen to divest all of its endowment from the fossil fuel industry. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, again, which was kind of formulated from Norway's oil exports, has divested along with the New York State Pension Fund most recently. And that is it. These are actually extra slides in case we wanted to go through it more, but I will turn it back over to Marta. And thank you for listening to me.
Great, thanks so much, Graham. I think that was really helpful overview. Sorry about the last slide situation. And with that, we're going to turn it over to some frequently asked questions that we get a lot about divestment. So I'm going to turn it over to our question asker, and Graham will be our question responder. And then again, we'll be taking some questions from all of you afterwards. So feel free to post your questions in the chat.
Yeah, I got a question. Okay. You guys all are talking about all the time how a divestment works, but ultimately we all know that it's just a symbolic act and it can't help but do anything worthwhile, right?
Well, great question, good sir. So in fact, that is not the case. While there is definitely symbolism in making divestment and putting that out to the world, we also know from these companies themselves that divestment is a singular existential risk to their business model that is in the internal documents of the American Petroleum Institute, of companies like Shell and Exxon. And it not only revokes their social license to operate, but it puts the pressure on them and makes it very hard to continue making plans to develop fossil fuel resources. So while we understand why the perception might be that it is purely symbolic, we know from the companies that it is not. And it is probably one of the most effective things Princeton could do with an endowment of its size to affect change and to achieve widespread emission reduction. But great question.
Yeah, I have a question. Isn't it hypocritical to accept fossil fuel or to reject fossil fuel investments and relationships when we use so many fossil fuels for our energy needs on campus?
A question we've heard many times, including from President himself in his reasoning for why the last divestment proposal was rejected. In fact, no, there's no hypocrisy in divesting and dissociating from companies while continuing to use fossil fuels, because we know that we can't switch from a campus that's heated by natural gas and runs electricity that's that's generated by burning that gas overnight. It's a process. We'd love to get there overnight, but we are recognizing that it wouldn't be realistic to make that demand. And furthermore, the reason that we use all of those fossil fuels is not necessarily because Princeton chose to do it. It's because those companies were so successful at combating efforts to switch to lower emission alternatives years ago, decades ago, when they knew climate change was an issue as far back as the 1960s and 70s. So while Princeton's own path to dissociating from fossil fuels is a process, one that will play out over the next few decades, the same will be true for the divestment, and it'll happen as soon as possible, as soon as technically feasible. But we see no contradiction at all in transitioning off of fossil fuels as a campus while divesting as quickly as we can.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm just a regular guy, and I've heard a lot about these fossil fuel companies and how they're actually making changes for the better. If they're already doing the things that we want them to do, they can't be all that bad, right?
Aha. So if you check any of these companies' social media pages, you might see glittery videos of their investments in things like carbon capture and biofuels. And while those things may eventually be important and could be parts of the solution, they make up a tiny portion of those companies' overall capital budgets. Less than 1% goes to research in renewable fuels, in carbon capture, and energy storage and electrification. The vast majority of their funding is going to increasing exploration in oil, gas, and coal assets. So if you follow the money and see where they're really putting their resources, you'll see a very different story than the one they're trying to tell on their Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages.
Thanks. I got one more question for you. I'm a prospective student, and I just have to ask, isn't research with institutions like Princeton exactly what we want these companies to do? And if so, why are we fighting it?
So while we don't want to take anything away from the researchers who are doing this very important work, we like to take a broader view, right? So these companies are partnering with Princeton. They're using Princeton's good name and projecting to the world, hey, we're not so bad. What happens then is that folks who might not be as attuned to those capital spending budgets or what these companies are doing to fund campaigns against climate action and emission reduction bills, you might think, hey, these companies are great. I shouldn't put pressure on them to change. I shouldn't be switching to alternatives that are not killing our chance of survival as a species. Well, that's exactly the issue, is that by giving these companies license to use our name to partner with the university, we're giving them a shield from criticism and making it harder for activists and for governments to hold them accountable to do the work that has to be done in order to put us on track. So while the research itself may be very important, sometimes it is questionable whether they're funding things that would allow them to continue to burn fossil fuels as opposed to the tried and true methods of decarbonization we know work today, like electrifying everything. It does cause harm, and we believe that getting that funding for that research could happen from other sources that don't have these ancillary effects of giving these companies a shield against the criticism that and the pressure we need to be putting on them. So wow, that was amazing. So many questions from different people. Really a broad spectrum of question askers. Now we'll turn it over to the folks in the audience. I see we've gotten some. Marta, I don't know if you want to curate some of the ones we've gotten in the chat, but yeah, I've seen a lot of them come in, which is awesome.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your questions. And we have a little bit of time, so if anyone else has any more, please keep adding them. So Graham, one of the questions we've gotten is, if Princeton divests, is it possible that a different investor will take Princeton's place who is less committed in other ways to climate change, i.e. Princeton could try to affect climate change as a stakeholder versus giving that power to someone else? How would you answer that question?
Sure, and I'll give a brief answer, and then I think Ryan is very well equipped to answer. This is something that does come up a lot, because the one camp is that we can engage with these companies as stakeholders and cause them to change the way that they're acting. Well, there's absolutely no evidence that Princo has ever done that. Princo is set up as a sort of indirect investor. They picked fund managers. They don't often hold stocks directly. And those fund managers are not activist investors. They're not going to board meetings and demanding that these companies change their ways. So we see no evidence that would happen, that might happen in the future. And as a result, the policy of engaging with these companies is not something that we've seen as a potential to enact change. Ryan, do you want to maybe add to that?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I was offline for a while there. I hope I didn't miss a whole lot. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because Princeton, on the one hand, they talk openly about how they've got this presumption against using the endowment for political purposes, or what's the word they use exactly? To basically to use their endowment to push positions. So they argue that while at the same time saying, well, no, in fact, their investment relationships give them the platform to make recommendations for how these companies might change, which to us is basically just another way of doing what they say they have never been able to do by divesting, which is just to make decisions, to push decisions along with their investment relationships. So it's kind of a doublespeak. And no, I mean, basically at every opportunity where Princeton's had the chance to make it clear that they do use their influence with these companies for good, they haven't. So there's the Climate 100 Plus agreement, which is something that Harvard signed on to, which is one of several prominent platforms that investors have signed on to basically say that they will use their investors' clout to influence companies from within. Princeton's had the opportunity to sign that for years now, and they never have. So that's just one example, I think, of how they have yet to really show us the receipts if they are making good things happen from within.
Great, thanks, Ryan. I'm gonna ask a couple more questions from the chat. So one question here is, why should divestment from fossil fuel companies be considered a political decision? It seems to me like a smart financial strategy to divest from businesses that have no future in a carbon-free economy. Ryan or Graham, do either of you want to take that one?
Sure, I can. I think the answer is it's being seen less and less as a political decision as it becomes more and more of an existential climate and survival issue. And we think that it's really clear now that it's definitely not a political issue because Princeton has its sustainability action plan where it declares very soberly that a value of the university is national and global decarbonization. So now that that's been officially declared on paper, we consider that to be an admission that Princeton doesn't consider decarbonization to be a political issue anymore. And frankly, it was rather ridiculous that they ever did in the first place. There's nothing that gets to our values quite so much as our survival. And so no, we've always kind of dismissed that argument that it's political out of hand.
Great, thanks, Ryan. I'm gonna ask one more from the chat. How do you address claims, even coming from reputable climate scientists, that divestment is not worth it if it's going to lead to mass unemployment? For either of you or anyone else.
I can jump in on that. So I think we see that across the board. There was a Wall Street Journal op-ed earlier today saying that the president's cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline will cause the loss of 11,000 jobs. Well, it's interesting when you see claims like that. First, because those jobs don't exist yet. They would be from construction in the future, but I think it misses the point sometimes of the amazing opportunity for job creation in clean energy alternatives. We know that jobs in efficiency work and installing solar and maintaining wind are huge job growers. They're in some places the fastest growing job industries in the country, like where I live in Vermont, where renewable industry is one of the biggest employers in the state. So I think it's always a balance. And while yes, jobs are very important, I think Princeton and we all have an obligation to be laser focused on tackling the emission situation as well. And I don't think they're at all mutually exclusive. I think it's just a shift in jobs to other areas. And we have great evidence that folks can be retrained in order to take the new jobs that'll come out of a big investment in clean energy.
Awesome, thanks, Graham. I'm trying to keep track of the chat here. I think we have time for one or two more questions before moving on to breakout rooms. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just catching up. Give me one moment. Maybe it is worth talking a little bit more about, I'm going to read one of the comments, concerns in the chats. I think this is good to take a little bit of time to kind of talk through this issue. So the comment question is, so I guess I'm still concerned about who might take that stakeholder place. Isn't divestment just giving up then? Shouldn't this movement be focused on affecting the change that we can and attempting to transform the minds of the Princo people versus giving up what little power we have? I don't know the answer to this question. I'm just working to understand the issue fully. So kind of the question about if Princeton divests, will someone else just come in, and shouldn't we stay in and try to engage? If it's possible to, yeah, just have one more moment on that.
Sure. So for one thing, again, there's already institutional barriers to us engaging, even if we wanted to. One is that oftentimes we're a minority shareholder that doesn't have that kind of like influence and seat at the table. And another is that, again, we have this presumption against political decision-making with our endowment. So unless the university were to make a pretty radical flip on that, they wouldn't really be in a position to do it regardless. Before we even get to any of that, though, I think that it's just really important to emphasize that before we talk about whether or not these investments are profitable, be it in terms of influence or be it in terms of money, we do first have to answer the question of whether or not it's consistent with our values as a university, right? Like you could make the same argument back for any of the previous divestments that we've already talked about. Let's say in 2006, when we had evidence that we were investing in companies that were engaged or in some way abetting genocide in Sudan, we could similarly make the argument there that, well, isn't it good just to stay invested with those companies and to try and steer them from within away from genocide? And, it's somewhat of an apples and oranges comparison, but the basis is the same. I mean, the basic argument is in either case would be still pretty flawed, I think. You have to ask yourself, look in the mirror and ask yourself, first off, am I comfortable, given my values, with even coming to the table in the first place? In our case, with these fossil fuel companies that are pretty clearly flouting scientific consensus, we think the answer is no. Graham, I'm sure you might have something to add to that.
Yeah, and I think that there's a kind of couple of related questions coming up about, why wouldn't we also be pushing the university to reinvest in things like renewable energy? Our campaign is driven largely by the rules of the road. So there is not a formalized process to get Princeton to invest in certain worthy causes. The divestment process is very formalized, and it requires that you hit all of these criteria just so that they divest. Of course, we would love to be able to guide investments in the future, but there's really not a process to do that. So our hope would be that's where some of the uninvested money would go, but we're kind of working within the rules of the road we have. There's another question that came up that's kind of related about, again, sort of giving up Princeton's role trying to influence these companies as an investor, and what happens when we drop out and someone else takes their place. I think, as I mentioned before, they have no evidence that by being invested today, we're guiding their decisions at all. And the second piece is a little bit personal anecdote, because I work at an electric utility, which is not exactly the same as a fossil fuel company, but invests on similar timescales. So if you're an oil or gas company, you have made investments in exploration infrastructure, in the drilling rigs, in the pipelines to serve an asset for the next 30 years. Those investments have been made, they're sunk costs. That means that it is in your financial interest to fight all activity, to fight all pushes away from fossil fuels, right? If there's a huge global shift away from fossil fuel consumption, then you have to eat cost on that investment. You're going to have stranded assets, and it's going to tank your share price. So by virtue of how these companies have operated and the long timescales they invest in, it means that they can't really get on board the clean energy transition. They can do it a little bit. They can buy up companies, make mergers and acquisitions, but at their core, these companies are completely tied inextricably to fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think that the illusion that we might be able to get them to be good companies is kind of just that. We have no belief that they can turn around their business model. These companies are like large warships. They're not nimble vessels that can do a 180 in a couple of years or even a decade. And so, as we know from these companies' internal documents, divestment is what is pushing them to make any changes if they are making changes. And it's really the best way that we can make our values known as a university, and also have any hope that they're going to be changing tack and moving away from their business model that's worked for the last 100 years.
Great, thanks, Graham. I think that was really helpful context and just helpful to hear. I'm going to ask one more from the chat, kind of question comment, and then we'll turn it over to breakout rooms. So The question is, as a stepping stone, have you explored getting divestment commitments from affiliated Princeton entities that have their own endowments? The Art Museum, McCarter, chaplaincies clubs, maybe the Rockefeller Human Values Center, founded by alumnus Lawrence Rockefeller, who is a founder of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund.
I'll
Idea?
take that real quick and just say that it's a great suggestion. I'll echo what Graham said in the previous answer, that it's just that Princeton's process as a university is much more formalized and we know what that process is. And that's why we've been going through that. And also that being the biggest endowment on campus would be the most impactful. But it's a good suggestion though. I'm at SPIA, the public policy school, and it's run through its own individual endowment. So, in theory, yeah, you could kind of build your way up to the top. So good suggestion and something we'll consider probably for future strategy.
And then I know I said that was maybe the last question, but just one more, and then I think we maybe will have asked all of them. If Princeton divests and then a fossil fuel company makes a sufficient commitment to invest in sustainable energy, how should that company be treated?
So, and I'll definitely leave something out that Graham should correct me about. According to our latest proposal, the process is basically that we're proposing essentially that we give these companies notice, first of all, that we're making these changes with our investment procedure. They have then a little bit of time to respond and either change their practices or explain their practices to show why they might be, fulfilling UN global climate goals, and they might be in that case, not objectionable to what we're based on what we're asking. If they can't do that and we end up divesting or we end up dissociating with them, and then eventually they do reform themselves so that they are okay, basically what we're proposing is that there's a committee process where they would go and they would have third-party verification to say, we've changed, we're better, we are not only promising to do things, but we have this third-party verifier to make sure we are doing those things, and the committee would review that and make a judgment. That's the process as we have proposed. Graham, have I left anything out?
No, I think that hit it. I mean, I think to start, our proposal was to divest from all fossil fuel companies. Through conversations with the resources committee, got the sense that the board, the finance committee, didn't feel it was consistent to ask that fossil fuel companies transition away from fossil fuels at a faster rate than Princeton itself was doing it. And as I mentioned before, we're on track as a university to get there by 2046, or in compliance with the Paris goals. So that is the criteria by which we would judge fossil fuel companies that we are invested or partnered with. And just lastly, I think I forgot to mention before we go into the breakout rooms, this is an awesome time to get involved. It's the farthest we've ever gotten with a fossil fuel divestment campaign. The proposal has been forwarded to the board. It's very likely that it will receive the endorsement of the resources committee. And so now is really the time to turn up the pressure and to make it known how important this issue is to all our alumni, to students, to faculty, so that the board realizes this is an issue that we care about. I think there are sometimes questions about, would divesting deter donations from certain alumni? Well, we've already deterred donations from over 2,000 members of the Princeton community by remaining invested. So I think the more we can make that message clear through the various proposals and campaigns we've got going on that we'll get into in the breakout rooms, I think the better chance we'll have that the board will vote a resounding yes and implement this come April.
Thanks, Graham. That's a perfect note to transition on. So we have about 15 minutes left. For the next 10 minutes before we